Soweto under fire. The country's largest township had a dark cloud hovering over it. June 16, 1976, presented a new form of resistance towards the Afrikaans language policy introduced under the Bantu education in 1953 under the then apartheid government. It was under Bantu education that the then apartheid government spent 644 rands on a white child's education as opposed to a mere 42 rands on a black child's education. It was such inequalities, coupled with the Afrikaans language being enforced on black students, that led to a revolt. On that fateful day of June the 16th, what was supposed to be a peaceful protest by black students against the Afrikaans language policy turned ugly. Police fired at thousands of protesting students, killing 176 of them and leaving thousands injured. It was such inequalities fought by the youth and political movements that paved the way to a new political dawn in South Africa.
When the mind is at peace without fear, the head is held high.
Where knowledge is free.
Where the world has not been broken up by narrow domestic walls.
Where words come out of the depths of truth.
Where tireless striving stretches its arms out towards perfection.
Where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way.
In the dreary desert sands of dead habit.
Where the mind is led forward by ever-widening thought into the heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
These words are taken from the film The Argumentative Indian, on the life of educationist and economist Amartya Sen. They're from a poem, Let My Country Awake, by R. Tagore, who reshaped 19th and 20th century Indian literature and was the first non-European to win the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature in 1913. His poem is a cry for the belief that social change is possible. Good evening. For the first time, you get to see Nana in human form. My name is Luavela Jongilanga. I am a young South African and journalist. I came out of the artificial intelligence sphere to greet you all for the special edition of Economics Unbound.
I am Prudence Babazile Makubalo. Good evening. I am the producer of Economics Unbound and a young South African journalist and broadcaster.
Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. I am your host, Thandeka Gubulembeki. Tonight we ask, how far has South Africa come on the road to providing access to quality education and creating the kind of skills and mindsets to power progress in this economy? Have we educated enough citizens? Have we reduced the dropout rates and kept enough people in educational institutions for longer? Have we created quality schools? Have we created the kind of communities of skills and capabilities that will secure our country's economy for years to come?
Nelson Mandela said, "No country really develops unless citizens are educated." So tonight we use the United Nations Human Development Index as a tool to answer the questions that Thandeka asked. Have we done enough since 1976? We take a look at the work of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who was central to the construction of the Human Development Index.
One of South Africa's great educationists, Neville Alexander, wrote that in the seamless web of South African history, the 16th of June 1976 represents both an end and a beginning. Those great events which began as innocently and undramatically as most significant moments in the history of a nation, were the culmination of decades of relatively peaceful protests by black students against the inequities of segregation and apartheid in the educational institutions of South Africa.
The late Alexandra also said the most striking feature of all the years of protest and resistance since the introduction of a modern system of schooling for black people after the inauguration of the Union of South Africa was the fact that all the student actions were motivated by the desire on their part for equality of the conditions of learning and of the content of education. The rifles and ammunition that Lord Lay Hector Peterson and his comrades that sent the Tsietsi Mashininis into exile and the Dan Mutsitis into prison to actually put an end to all illusions about achieving equality of conditions and of educational content, as long as the systems of racial inequality that obtained in South Africa remained.
Literacy and enrollment in formal education are the main indicators in the construction of the Education Achievement Index. Human development is about basically enlarging people's choices, emphasizing the freedom to be healthy, to be educated, and to enjoy a decent economic standard of living. It extends to a broader range of capabilities, including political freedoms, human rights, and self-confidence, empowerment, and participation. That is why Nelson Mandela said that education is the most powerful weapon through which you can change society. Hence the question, how have we done in South Africa? The question and the figures indicate that education has significantly contributed to progress in the past 40 years in our country, but inequality in access to and quality of education is a critical challenge to advancing human development. Before we get granular now, let's listen to President Ramaphosa, who addressed some of these issues on Monday. After that, let's listen to a clip of the former President Nelson Mandela as we walk through memory lane and consider and reflect on his legacy in education.
For young people, this is particularly a bitter legacy. Although we have achieved near universal access to basic education, many young people leave school without the skills and the experience that is necessary to find meaningful employment. And although we have massively increased enrollment in higher education and have broadened access to students who come from poor and middle-class families, we have yet to break the cycle of poverty that is passed from one generation to the next. Quite significantly, public revenue will plummet and the dire unemployment situation that we currently have in our country will worsen. This is particularly difficult on young people whose studies have been interrupted, whose businesses may need to close, who may lose jobs, and who do not have the benefit of savings or assets. Coronavirus has exacerbated the deep racial, economic, and social inequalities in our country. This virus has just laid them bare. We must ensure that our response to coronavirus and our economic recovery program puts in place a more just, equitable, and prosperous society. Young people in particular have been severely disadvantaged by the effects of the pandemic, and we need to ensure that they lead the economic and social recovery that must follow. Young people are the ones who are mostly going to lose jobs as a result of this pandemic. The 500 billion relief package that government announced several weeks ago is directed at those businesses and workers most badly affected and vulnerable households. By providing a 6-month top-up for social grant recipients and introducing a temporary special COVID-19 grant for unemployed people in our country, government has sought to put cash into the hands of the poor as quickly and as efficiently as possible. These measures, which are quite historic in their scale as well as their reach, are an immediate response to an unforeseen crisis that we are going through now. However, we will need to put in place further measures in the medium to long term to ensure that the economy is able to recover and that the jobs that have been lost in some way or fashion can be regained as soon as possible. That is why on this Youth Day, we should focus on the place and the role of young people in the reconstruction of our country after the coronavirus.
When Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela went to school for the first time, the first member of his family to do so, he did not know that he would become the symbol of hope for a better education and a better future for millions in South Africa and the rest of the world. David James Smith writes in his book Young Mandela that Madiba himself pointed out that both his father and mother were illiterate, had no formal schooling and never learned to read or write, but that they certainly were not ignorant and had great wisdom, and that they supported and encouraged his education. He went to school at the age of about 7. His father realized that his son had a vision and a dream from an early age to help these people. He asked the Tembu chief, Jongintaba Talinjebu, on his deathbed to take care of his son and give him an education. Since then, education always played a most important role in Madiba's life. Even on Robben Island, he kept studying and inspired those around him to do so. After he was freed, long before he became president, he started working tirelessly to improve the quality of education for all in the country.
Education is one of the most important weapons in a country, and the extent to which black education is neglected is something very difficult to put in words. We wanted to transform education into a national asset, into an instrument we can use for development.
He asked young South Africans to help him in building a new South Africa. He crisscrossed the country in his quest for a better education for all. Many from South Africa and overseas joined hands with him and helped building schools, classrooms and libraries. providing teaching media and bursaries, renovating schools and uplifting communities.
Sometime last year, I read in the media that there was a school here under a tree, and that the teacher was looking for a second tree because the class had grown bigger. Fortunately, the next day, the head of BP throughout the world, Mr. Brown, came to pay a courtesy visit, and I drew his attention to this report, and I asked if I could bring him here so that we could see the school under a tree. He told me he was leaving that very day, but that the head of BP here, Mr. Paswana, would accompany me to Soshanguve.
In 2007, Nelson Mandela founded the Nelson Mandela Institute at Fort Hare to take forward his work in education and rural development in South Africa and beyond.
The number of unemployed young people is expected to balloon as South Africa loses jobs due to the economic crisis and the deep economic contraction and shock created by the COVID-19 virus. Please listen to this brief package by Mbongeni Mutwa.
A problem that just won't go away, the country's stubbornly high unemployment rate, especially youth unemployment. Early this year, youth unemployment was estimated at around 52%. The situation is much worse now as a result of the devastating impact of COVID-19 on the economy.
Job losses and bankruptcies of the small and medium enterprises as well as some big ones. And it's exactly that type of a post-COVID economic recovery plan that needs to be a top priority, literally exactly as the same priority as the public health COVID-19. And these two need to go in glove and hand and glove together. And at the moment, the government seems to be occupied with one side, but not the other side of the equation. And that is the problem.
Hence the calls on government to act.
We have to take the bold decisions about the labour market and access for young people into the labour market and how we get a much faster growing economy and firms that are expanding and wanting to hire young people. That's critical. Those are the reforms we have to get going.
But reviving the economy and job creation will require a move to stage 1 lockdown as soon as possible.
The sooner we go from lockdown 3 to normal or lockdown 1, the better. But there is the balance that we have to strike between public health risk, millions of people losing their lives, as well as millions of people getting back to earning livelihood. So that balance is what the government is at the moment trying to strike.
All eyes will be on Finance Minister Tito Mboweni next week when he delivers the long-awaited emergency budget in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. He will, among others, give a clear indication of how government plans to revive economic growth and job creation under the new circumstances. Mbongeni Mutwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Thandeka has prepared a package on different waves of student activism that each time propelled society forward and brought the country to a point of reckoning.
Education has been historically a constant site of struggle in South Africa. Each wave of radical student-led movements have pushed the country to a point of reckoning, bringing about change and evolution in education and changing social views and values. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the struggle against Bantu education gained steam. The apartheid government enacted legislation that ushered in education for servanthood, drawers of wood and herders of cattle, the government of the day said, was all the black child would amount to. Communities revolted, teachers started alternative schools, and marches and protests took to the street. Again, decades into the democratic state, the mouths of babes rang the call for a truly decolonized and free education. The Fees Must Fall movement led to public revolt about the unfinished business of democracy. But prior to that, the 1976 generation made a cry for the struggle against Afrikaans and unequal education, as the government had invested more in white children than in black children. After that, people's education in the 1980s rang as a call. Education in our country has been a site of struggle.
Please listen to this explanatory package that my producer Prudence Makubalo prepared on the Human Development Index and why we as a country need to exert and apply ourselves as we try to catch up and bounce back after the economic devastation of COVID-19. Here's what the HDI or Human Development Index is.
The Human Development Index is a statistic composite index of life expectancy, education and per capita income indicators which are used to rank countries into 4 tiers of human development. A country scores a higher HDI when the lifespan, education level and the gross national income per capita is higher. It was developed by Pakistan economist Mahbub al-Haq, an Indian economist Amartya Sen, and was further used to measure a country's development by the United Nations Development Programme. The index is based on the human development approach, often framed in terms of whether people are able to be and do desirable things in life. Examples include being well-fed, sheltered, healthy, working, good education, voting and participation in community life. In terms of Human Development Index of South Africa, in 2017 it was 0.699 points, leaving it in 114th place in the table of 189 countries published. In 2018, Brand South Africa welcomed South Africa's improvement in the 2018 Human Development Report, which ranked South Africa 113th out of 189 countries. The report was released recently by the United Nations Development Programme, which indicates that South Africa's 2018 ranking is 113 out of 189 countries, with an overall human development score increased to 0.699.
Now, let us listen to Amartya Sen explaining this courtesy of the United Nations, which permitted us to show our viewers what one of the architects of the HDI had to say about the link between education and powerful human progress. Amartya Sen is based at the Harvard University in the United States, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for Economics in 1998. Please listen in.
I feel the importance of education is, first of all, the recognition of that. Education in general is perhaps the most important thing to accept and emphasize and work for. Nothing as important as education. And yet, we have the choices to be faced given institutional as well as budgetary limitation. Now there I must say, when we were doing the human development thing, my view was similar to the person I was, he was a very close friend and was working for, namely Mahbub al-Haq from Pakistan, who, and he and I were undergraduates together in Cambridge, and we talked about them even when we were undergraduate, the centrality of primary education. We agreed on that. So when Mahbub took charge of the human development report office and started producing the human development reports, we worked out, and we had no disagreement on that, that the first focus has to be on primary education. This doesn't mean that secondary education is unimportant or university education is unimportant. That's not the case. They are very important. But A, you can't do secondary education and university education without doing primary education first. And B, to put your money on educating a small group of primary educated people, to give them more and more education while leaving lots of people out of the primary education, is one of the gravest injustices that one can think of. So that's why, in the context of the Human Development Index, for example, which I helped Mahbub to construct, we were clear about Mahbub and I that we wanted to, and there were others, there were other advisors working with us at that time. I was not the only one. And that was, we had a clear focus that primary education has to be placed as very central. So literacy became very important, though years of schooling came in, which included secondary schooling as well. So we added that, but the primary education remained very central. So my position is still the same, that we should not make secondary education the enemy of primary education. We need I think there's no case why we should not have universal primary education in every country in the world today. It doesn't cost that much money, and it has a huge reward to pay. So to the extent that people emphasize that, I'm in favor of that very much. But to the extent that that is meant to mean, that is interpreted to mean that secondary education and university education could be neglected, that's just not right. You have to change. There are lots of things, and this, in the context of Africa, this is particularly important, because quite often the higher education establishments are also very badly underdeveloped. And while primary education is not widespread, it's not the only failure that we have to address. So I think it's a question of having a balance there.
Well, welcome back. In 2015, the police arrested Kgosi Chikane on the grounds of Parliament. Students from 4 universities gathered at Parliament to protest against the proposed fee hikes. They demanded free higher education. Let's take a look.
That's a stun grenade on sitting students. Look at that, I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything. Ridiculous. Also, a police officer today, they want to arrest me. All we want to do is go to Bladen's Monday, asking about fees. And then I came.
Now, Re Kgotsofetse Chikane joins me now. Good afternoon. You're a graduate student good evening. You're a graduate student at Oxford and an author now. And can you reflect back on that day, and can you tell us, as a young South African, how far you think this country has come since 1976 in honouring the demands of both your father's generation, Frank Chikane, and the demands of your generation?
Yeah, gosh, I haven't thought about that day in a very long time, actually. So thank you for reminding me. The one memory I have of that day is the moment that young South Africans, in quite a united manner, and it happened over the course of the week, it wasn't just that day, it finally came to the conclusion that the only way that we can kind of advance ourselves and push ourselves is if we demand that change and stop asking for it, right? Stop asking for society to change, but force society to change. And that's kind of had like a deep impact on my understanding of the economics of our society, the social aspect of our society now. And when you think about 1976, you think about an entire generation that asked the same question of, we are no longer asking for permission to change our society, we're demanding change and we'll do it ourselves. And you can see the country kind of does this every decade or so, where young people kind of demand this change. But what made 2015 different is that this happened in a democratic South Africa. When I think about young people now, I always joke around with my friends that my generation has never experienced an economic boom. We have no idea what it means to live in a good economic climate. We have no idea what it means to live in a good social climate. Right? And this is not to say that there have been no advances since 1994. The struggles that my parents went through, that the older generation went through to create the freedoms that we have today are tremendous wins in our society. However, the actions or the lack of action since 1994 in improving the lives of young people has inadvertently created what I describe as a lost generation of young people in South Africa.
Now,
and
why
the
would you
question
describe
I like posing to the older generation?
I was going to ask you,
Yes.
Mr. Chikane, why you describe your generation as lost?
So when you think about our generation, it's that combination of highest levels of youth unemployment. We are at the forefront of the impacts of systemic poverty in our country. We have lived in a world where we have remained the most unequal country in the world for the past 20 years, right? It's that idea that there are 4 million young people in this country, 18 to 25-year-old, who are not in employment in any form of education or any form of training. That is 4 million people who are sitting at home doing nothing. And the assumption is that somehow, some way, 10 years from now, those 4 million people will somehow magically become economically productive. And that's what I see as a lost generation. The fact that whenever we announce our matric results, we have at least 40% of people who started grade 1 not getting to matric. When you add those numbers up, you create this storm, right? This critical mass of young people who are not involved in the economy, who are not involved in our society. And that's why I describe them as lost. And the question is, right, the question is that not that they're gone, but the fact is when they wake up and realize they lost, the type of changes that they'll demand.
What is your sense of the solutions, and what do you think you can mobilize your generation to do to turn these circumstances around for our country's sake and for posterity?
I think we need to keep up the energy, right, and demanding for a society and a livelihood that we deem worth living, right? And I really enjoyed your Amartya Sen segment, right? One of Amartya Sen's core phrases is that people should be allowed to live a life that they deem worth living. And I think young people in the country should demand to always be able to live a life that they deem worth living. And that can be in many different ways. We saw today that there were protests at Pretoria High School for girls, again, where young women were demanding to say that we do not want to learn in an environment that is not conducive to our well-being, and an environment that discriminates against us, an environment that does not teach us to become a productive citizen of our country. Young people are now relearning that they don't have to be these passive recipients of the Rainbow Nation myth or the idea that we should all be united. And I think that's the first step, that change in mindset amongst young people, and I think it's happening. And the second step is in actively not falling for the trap of the political structure of our society that does not acknowledge the presence of young people. Right? And once we get into that step and get into that political arena and organize ourselves, I think that will be a key step or key movement in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Chikane. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
And now, after the break, we will be joined by Mary Metcalf. Welcome back. Professor Mary Metcalf has worked in education since 1974 in various capacities. She taught in the Department of Education at WITS before being appointed as Gauteng's member of the Executive Council responsible for education from 1994 to 1999. She served as MEC for Agriculture, Conservation and Environment and Land Affairs from 1999 to 2004. Welcome, Professor Metcalf. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tandeka.
Earlier we played a clip, and it had Madiba in it, and we didn't play the portion where he says, "And I called Mary Metcalf." Do you remember this?
Yeah, it was a real privilege to be working in many capacities capacities at that time, and to have a different interaction with a remarkable man.
So you've got this wealth of institutional memory on the numerous attempts that we have made as a country and as a nation to improve our education system, both in terms of access and also in terms of quality, as well as the type and content of and the spirit of the curriculum. How far do you think we've come? How have we contributed to this economy by improving our education?
Well, the progress that we've made since 1976 needs to be understood in the reality that it was a different country then. And it was different in so many ways that young people today experience as a very distant, not even family memory, because it wasn't part of their direct life. When we look at the world and the South Africa that we had in 1976, it was a situation where education was profoundly unequal, where African children were told that they were in white-controlled South Africa, and where education was explicitly structured in order to meet the needs of a labor market that saw African children as servile workers in a white-controlled economy. They were in an education system which promoted very few children into a high school, and in which the overcrowding was extensive because it was very serious levels of overcrowding because the labor market had required that more and more young children were in school. So it was unequal, it was racially defined, it was in a very inferior education system, and the children were in families that were deeply affected by the Bantustan policy, by influx control. And in fact, African people needed permission to be in white areas. So the progress since 1976 is huge, because we now have a single education system. The Bantustan departments, the tricameral departments have disappeared.
But we still have grinding poverty. We still have grinding poverty, which affects the levels of educational attainment that the majority of especially black children can attain in our society.
We have grinding poverty, we have structural inequalities, we have poor infrastructure, and that's been highlighted by the COVID epidemic. We see differential outcomes in terms of children from what we call quintile 5 schools relative to quintile 1 and 2 schools. We see a racial segmentation in terms of performance. We see many children who don't have the basic resources. So this is a huge development from 1976 to 1992, where we are now in 2020, but we are not yet where we should be. And I think on the anniversary of 76, we should be honoring the sacrifices that so many people made to bring us to where we are.
What should we do to get better? How could we possibly do better in terms of the Education Index and the Human Development Index?
So, Thandeka, I think in terms of education, the COVID epidemic has highlighted some of the inequalities. We've seen that there's still so many schools without adequate water, for example. We need to get the basic infrastructure right. We need to direct resources in a way that we consciously combat the inequities in terms of the not only water and infrastructure and sanitation, but also in terms of reducing the large class sizes. We should be providing more resources and more support to teachers that are teaching the poorest children. We need to be able to make sure that the 3 large provinces of KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and Eastern Cape receive more resources in order to be able to provide more support for teachers.
Professor Metcalf, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Now, let's take a short break. Welcome back. On Skype, we have UNICEF, that's United Nations Agency UNICEF, South Africa Chief of Education of the Education Sector. He's Dr. Wycliffe Otieno. Welcome, Dr. Otieno. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, and glad to be with you this evening.
How do you think of us? What do you think of us in terms of our achievements over the past 40 years in education and in generally chasing that Human Development Index, trying to do better?
Thanks much. And indeed, South Africa has made tremendous progress in education. You would look at education from three perspectives. One, the issue of access. Two, the content of education. And three, the outcomes of education or outcomes of learning. On the first one on access, the country has done pretty well across all levels. Primary education is universal. It's actually free. It's equitable, because the philosophy of funding education is based on the quintile, which is geared towards breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty, given the history of this country. Secondary education is also the same. You look at the length of schooling in South Africa, one of the longest on the continent, and that is very good and very deliberate for a number of reasons, not least of which that schools are actually protective environments. The quality of learning, that's the third. The content of learning, which is the second aspect. The country has come a long way in trying to get the right mix of skills, competencies, knowledge, abilities that each citizen should have, and therefore gone through education reforms no less than 3 times. And with the current CAPS curriculum, actually, you can't fault Brookings Institution, which is one of the best think tanks known in the world. And Brookings Institution, in its analysis of the curriculum in South Africa, says that curriculum is actually sound, is relevant. It is geared towards equipping young people in South Africa with the knowledge, the skills, and the competencies to be ready for the 21st century. So the whole focus on learning for the future, the 4 P's plus P, which is creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication with problem solving. And the final aspect in terms of the outcomes of learning, which has several elements. It has the extent to which children achieve the required competencies as measured by learning outcomes. It is about the international competitiveness of the graduates of the system. It's about their employability and therefore relevance for the economy, but it's about also how they fit in the society generally. So you can measure along all those particular parameters and recognize that, one, challenges still remain, but two, the country has done its best in trying to make sure that the rights of children and South Africans to quality education is achieved. Now, the element of the Human Development Index is quite complex and not a straightforward thing, because you can't just measure the quality of life and say that because of ABC, the education system in South Africa is low or has failed. Look at Nigeria, one of the most educated of societies. Where is it in terms of Human Development Index relative to South Africa? And the HDI is about the health, is about the education, is about several components. But the role of education is there and is desirable. One, in helping to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. Two, in recognizing the intersectorality of education with other things, including nutrition, and the fact that more than 9 million meals are being provided to children every day within the education space. You have this kind of transport and many things. So the country has come a long way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Otieno. That's all we have time for, unfortunately, this evening. Thank you very much, dear viewer, for joining us on this special June 16 edition of Economics Unbound. Cheerio, Ponantin Mawich.